The Ardennes Forest, Belgium, December 18th, 1944. Major Friedrich Steiner of the Wehrmacht's 2nd Panzer Division stood in ankle-deep snow, staring at what should have been a worthless piece of scrap metal. The American jeep before him had been abandoned 3 days earlier during the chaotic opening of Germany's surprise offensive. Bullet holes punctured the hood. The windshield was shattered. The left front tire was flat. Oil leaked from somewhere beneath the chassis, staining the pristine snow black. This vehicle looked dead. Steiner had seen hundreds of wrecked vehicles in 5 years of war. He knew what a destroyed machine looked like. Yet something about this particular jeep nagged at him, a professional curiosity honed by years as a vehicle recovery specialist. Against standard procedure, instead of torching it where it sat, he ordered his crew to tow it back to their field workshop near Sankt Vith. What Steiner discovered in the next 72 hours would fundamentally alter his understanding of American engineering. This broken jeep would teach him a lesson that Nazi propaganda had spent years trying to suppress. The war would not be won by superior Germanic will or tactical brilliance. It would be won by the side that built vehicles soldiers could repair with a wrench and a prayer. To understand what Steiner found, you need to understand what he'd been taught to believe. Nazi ideology had constructed an elaborate fiction about American industrial capability. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The narrative was seductive in its simplicity. Americans, German soldiers were told, were soft, materialistic consumers. They built refrigerators and luxury automobiles, not serious military equipment. When America's factories converted to war production, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels assured the German people they would produce crude, mass-market garbage, quantity over quality, steel over spirit. The pronouncements were confident and absolute. German engineering represented the pinnacle of technical achievement, precision manufacturing that no assembly line society could hope to match. The Kübelwagen, Germany's military utility vehicle, seemed to prove this narrative correct. Designed by Ferdinand Porsche and based on the Volkswagen Beetle, it was lightweight, fuel-efficient, and cleverly engineered to use minimal strategic materials. In early testing, it had even outperformed four-wheel drive competitors in snow and sand, despite having only rear-wheel drive. German engineers were justifiably proud, but Steiner, unlike the propagandists in Berlin, had spent the last 4 years keeping German vehicles operational under brutal field conditions. He had watched Kübelwagens break down in Russian mud. He had seen their air-cooled engines seize in North African heat. He had ordered repairs that required specialized parts that took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. Each Kübelwagen seemed to have its own peculiar mechanical personality, quirks that required experienced mechanics to diagnose and fix. The simplicity that looked so elegant on paper became complexity in practice. By December 1944, Steiner's unit was chronically short of operational vehicles. Germany's industrial production was collapsing under Allied bombing. Parts were scarce. Skilled mechanics were being reassigned to infantry units as casualties mounted. Every functioning vehicle was precious beyond measure, which was why, when Steiner's recovery team towed the damaged American jeep into their makeshift workshop, he decided to examine it personally before ordering its destruction. The Willys MB jeep sat under harsh overhead lamps, its olive-drab paint scratched and pockmarked with shrapnel damage. Steiner approached it with the mixture of professional curiosity and ideological disdain that characterized most German officers' attitudes toward American equipment. Mass-produced, crude, adequate perhaps for the Americans' supposedly inferior standards, but nothing that would impress a trained engineer. He started with the obvious damage. The flat tire was a battlefield casualty, nothing diagnostic. The shattered windshield could be folded down anyway, a design feature that actually impressed him. The bullet holes in the hood told their own story of close combat. But it was when Steiner opened the hood that his professional assessment began to shift. The engine was the L-134 Go Devil inline four-cylinder. At 60 horsepower, it was less powerful than the Kübelwagen's upgraded engine. Nothing impressive about raw output. But as Steiner studied the layout, he noticed something that made him pause. Every component was accessible. The spark plugs were positioned where a soldier could reach them without special tools. The oil dipstick protruded prominently, clearly marked. The air filter housing could be removed with bare hands, no wrenches required. The entire engine seemed designed for someone who wasn't a trained mechanic. Steiner called over Unteroffizier Hans Müller, his best mechanic. Müller had maintained German vehicles since the invasion of Poland. He could diagnose a transmission problem by sound alone. His hands were permanently stained with grease and oil. He represented the skilled craftsman that German military doctrine assumed would always be available. Müller examined the engine with the same mixture of curiosity and skepticism. After several minutes, he looked up at Steiner with an expression the Major had rarely seen on his face, confusion mixed with something approaching respect. "Herr Major," Müller said slowly, "this engine is designed for an idiot to maintain." It was not meant as a compliment, but Steiner understood immediately that Müller had identified something profound. German vehicles required skilled labor to maintain. The Jeep required only basic competence and standard tools. In a long war of attrition, that difference wasn't a weakness. It was a strategic advantage. They moved to the drivetrain. The transfer case for the four-wheel drive system was elegantly simple. A single lever could shift power between two-wheel and four-wheel drive. No complex mechanisms, no specialized knowledge required. Müller traced the drive shafts and examined the differentials. Everything was robust, heavy-gauge steel construction designed to absorb punishment. "It's crude," Müller admitted, "but I could rebuild this entire drivetrain in a field workshop with standard tools. No special equipment needed." Steiner found that assessment more disturbing than reassuring. German vehicles increasingly required factory-level repairs for major components. Field workshops could perform basic maintenance, but anything serious meant evacuating the vehicle to a depot far behind the lines. Time they didn't have. Resources they couldn't spare. The Jeep seemed designed with the assumption that serious repairs would happen in combat conditions, performed by soldiers, not specialists. Steiner requested a captured American field manual from intelligence. What arrived was the TM10-1513, an illustrated guide for Jeep maintenance and operation. He read it with growing amazement. The manual assumed no specialized knowledge. Every procedure was explained with simple diagrams. Every part was identified with clear photographs. A soldier with basic literacy could learn to maintain this vehicle in an afternoon. German manuals, by contrast, were technical documents that assumed significant mechanical knowledge. They were written by engineers for trained mechanics. The difference in philosophy was stark and troubling. The Americans designed vehicles for the reality of modern warfare equipment that could be maintained by conscripts with minimal training. Germany designed vehicles for an idealized scenario where skilled craftsmen were always available. Müller and two other mechanics worked through the night performing a complete inspection. They found standardization that seemed impossible by German standards. Every bolt was the same size category. Every nut fit standard wrenches. Parts were clearly marked with identification numbers. The chassis components could be accessed without disassembling half the vehicle. "Herr Major," Müller reported at dawn, "I could train a crew of infantry privates to perform every repair in this manual within 3 days. With our Kübelwagen, it takes months to properly train a mechanic." Steiner ordered them to attempt repairs on the damaged Jeep using only the tools and supplies available in their field workshop. It was a test. Could this American vehicle actually be fixed under combat conditions, or was the simple design merely theoretical? Müller's team replaced the flat tire with one salvaged from another captured Jeep. They patched the bullet holes in the hood with sheet metal. They traced the oil leak to a damaged gasket and fashioned a replacement from available materials. They bypassed the shattered windshield entirely, folding the frame down against the hood. 4 hours later, Müller turned the ignition key. The Go Devil engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. It ran rough for the first 30 seconds, then smoothed out to a steady idle. Müller adjusted the throttle, listening to the engine's response. After 5 years of maintaining German vehicles, he knew the sound of a motor that would keep running. This one would. Steiner ordered a test drive. He rode in the passenger seat while Müller drove the patched-together jeep across the frozen landscape. They pushed it through conditions that would have immobilized most vehicles in their motor pool: deep snow, steep hills, muddy ruts where other vehicles had become stuck. The jeep handled everything. Its four-wheel drive system provided traction where the Kübelwagen's rear-wheel drive would have been useless. Its simple suspension absorbed punishment without complaint. After 90 minutes of deliberate abuse, they returned to the workshop. Müller shut down the engine and turned to Steiner. "This vehicle has been shot, abandoned, left in winter conditions for 3 days, and just driven harder than we would treat our own equipment. It should not be running." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Better than half the Kübelwagens in our motor pool." Steiner requested production data through intelligence channels. What came back destroyed any remaining illusions about American industrial capacity. The Willys Overland plant in Toledo, Ohio, was producing Jeeps at 1,500 vehicles per week. The Ford plant in Michigan added another 1,000 per week to that total. Combined American Jeep production exceeded 12,000 vehicles every single month. Germany's total production of the Kübelwagen during the entire war would barely reach 50,000 vehicles. America produced that many Jeeps in 4 months. The mathematics was crushing and undeniable. For every German military vehicle, America was building 12 American equivalents. This wasn't a production advantage. This was industrial annihilation. But the numbers became even more devastating when Steiner understood the implications. These Jeeps weren't just for American forces. They were being shipped to every Allied nation through Lend-Lease. The Soviet Union received over 50,000 through this program. The British used them extensively. Free French forces drove them across North Africa. Chinese forces used them in Burma. America had built a standardized military vehicle and was supplying it to every ally fighting against the Axis. The logistical achievement staggered comprehension. Steiner learned that American supply depots maintained parts inventories that ensured any Jeep could be repaired within hours, anywhere in the world. Standardization meant a single bolt design worked globally. German vehicles required unique parts for different models, different production runs, sometimes even different individual vehicles from the same factory. The supply nightmare was killing German forces as surely as enemy fire. Steiner wrote a detailed technical report. In it, he identified the fundamental philosophical difference that separated German and American approaches to military vehicle engineering. Germany designed vehicles at the edge of what was technically possible, extracting maximum performance from minimum resources through sophisticated engineering and precision manufacturing. It was impressive, elegant, and completely inappropriate for the industrial war they were actually fighting. Every German vehicle was a minor technical achievement. Every loss was difficult to replace. America designed vehicles with massive safety margins, compensating for any inefficiency with brute force production and pragmatic simplicity. The Jeep wasn't elegant. It was effective. A Jeep could be driven by anyone, repaired by anyone, and supplied through a global logistics network that treated vehicles as expendable, replaceable tools of war. Steiner's report travelled up the chain of command where it met the same fate that befell so many accurate assessments of Allied industrial capacity. It was dismissed. The response from Wehrmacht High Command reflected the same ideological blindness that characterized Nazi leadership's approach to uncomfortable facts. Reality was less important than maintaining the narrative. A senior officer's notation on Steiner's report read, "American vehicles are adequate for their purposes, but lack the technical sophistication of German engineering. No action required." It was a perfect summary of the strategic delusion that was costing Germany the war. They confused technical complexity with military effectiveness. They valued engineering elegance over battlefield utility. They believed their own propaganda about American industrial weakness, and they paid for these mistakes with every kilometre of retreat. As January 1945 turned to February, Steiner watched his predictions come true with depressing accuracy. German forces were increasingly immobilized by fuel shortages, parts shortages, and the inability to repair complex vehicles under battlefield conditions. Meanwhile, Allied forces advanced with supply lines that never seemed to break. American Jeeps appeared everywhere, performing roles German planners hadn't anticipated. They towed artillery pieces. They carried wounded soldiers. They transported ammunition. They served as mobile command posts and reconnaissance platforms. The versatility was possible because of robust design and the certainty that if one jeep was destroyed, 3 more would arrive as replacements tomorrow. German soldiers who captured jeeps often kept them for personal use, abandoning their Kübelwagens whenever possible. This preference spoke louder than any technical analysis. The jeep worked in conditions where German vehicles failed. It kept running when German vehicles broke down. And when it did break, anyone could fix it with basic tools and the illustrated manual. Steiner's unit retreated across Belgium and into Germany itself as Allied forces pressed their advantage. By March 1945, his vehicle recovery section was operating with a fleet that was 30% captured American equipment, not because of ideological preference, but because German vehicles simply weren't available. The factories were destroyed, the supply lines were cut, the skilled mechanics were dead or reassigned. The captured jeep that Steiner had repaired in December was still running in April. It had been shot 3 more times. It had rolled over once when a bridge collapsed. It had been driven through freezing rivers and burning villages. Müller had performed field repairs using scavenged parts and improvised solutions. The engine had never been rebuilt. The transmission had never failed. It just kept running. Müller, who had maintained German vehicles his entire adult life, admitted something to Steiner in the final weeks of the war. "I was taught that German engineering was the best in the world. I believed it, but this American jeep has taught me that the best engineering is the engineering that works when everything else fails." The story takes a remarkable turn after Germany's surrender in May 1945. Thousands of German prisoners of war, including vehicle specialists like Müller, were processed through Allied detention camps. At some facilities, German mechanics were assigned to work in American motor pools, maintaining the endless stream of military vehicles that had won the war. For professional soldiers like Müller who ended up at such assignments, it was an education that would reshape their understanding of industrial production entirely. They watched American mechanics, many of them teenagers barely trained, perform repairs that would have required master craftsmen in Germany. The difference wasn't skill, it was system design. Every part had a number. Every repair had a procedure documented in the manual. Every problem had a solution that didn't require improvisation, or specialized knowledge, or custom fitting. It was the opposite of everything they'd been taught about quality and craftsmanship. And it worked better than anything they'd ever seen in practice. The American system assumed soldiers were interchangeable. It assumed vehicles were expendable. It assumed victory came from overwhelming material superiority, not individual technical excellence or ideological determination or superior willpower. For many German prisoners, especially those who would later return to rebuild West Germany, these lessons in pragmatic engineering proved more valuable than any formal education they'd received. The economic miracle of West Germany in the 1950s and 60s, the Wirtschaftswunder, was built partly on lessons learned from American mass production, techniques observed during the war and occupation. Former Wehrmacht mechanics became industrial engineers in the new Federal Republic. They applied American pragmatism to German precision, creating a hybrid approach that combined the best elements of both systems. The Volkswagen Beetle, which became Germany's answer to mass-market transportation, incorporated design philosophy directly influenced by American approaches: standardization, simplicity, ease of repair, mass production at scale. The vehicle that helped rebuild Germany was designed with principles learned from studying American wartime engineering. In 1998, surviving members of various Wehrmacht units held a reunion. American veterans were invited, and the conversations revealed what had really mattered in the war. A German veteran, identified only as a former vehicle specialist who had served in the Ardennes, spoke about vehicles rather than battles. His comments were recorded by military historians documenting veteran testimony. "We never had vehicles like yours," he said, speaking through an interpreter but with unmistakable emotion. "Your Jeep could go anywhere, do anything. When it broke, anyone could fix it. We had better tanks, perhaps, better tactics in some battles, but you had better logistics. You taught us that wars are won in factories, not just on battlefields. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. It was a hard lesson, but it was the right lesson. The final production numbers tell the story with brutal mathematical clarity. Over 640,000 Jeeps were produced during World War II by America. Germany manufactured approximately 50,000 Kübelwagens during the entire conflict. The ratio was 12-1, and that disparity extended across every category of military production. American Jeeps served in every theatre of war. They climbed mountain roads in Italy. They forded rivers in France. They crossed deserts in North Africa. They navigated jungles in Burma and the Pacific Islands. They operated in temperatures from -40 degrees to positive 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The design worked everywhere because it was designed for reality, not theory. General George C. Marshall, United States Army Chief of Staff, called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. The historical record proves him correct. United States Army historian Hugh M. Cole documented how Jeep mobility gave Allied forces tactical flexibility that German commanders couldn't match with their limited vehicle resources. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs that most senior officers regarded the Jeep as one of the 5 pieces of equipment most vital to success in Africa and Europe. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who followed American forces through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France, wrote words that became famous. "Good Lord, I don't think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. It goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat." The Jeep wasn't the most powerful vehicle of the war. It wasn't the fastest vehicle. It wasn't the most heavily armed vehicle. It was simply the most effective. When Major Friedrich Steiner first examined that damaged Jeep in December 1944, he saw more than a vehicle. He saw the future and Germany's place in it. He saw a machine designed by a nation that understood modern warfare required industrial systems, not just individual technical achievements, not just ideological conviction or battlefield courage, but logistics and production capacity. The Jeep represented everything the Third Reich couldn't accept. That material superiority mattered more than supposed racial superiority. That pragmatism beat ideology. That quantity had a quality all its own. Steiner's report was filed and forgotten, joining countless other accurate assessments that contradicted Nazi leadership's fundamental beliefs about the nature of the conflict they were fighting. But reality doesn't care about ideology. The mathematics of production determined the outcome long before the final battles were fought or the last territories were contested. After the war, captured German documents revealed numerous technical assessments of Allied equipment. The pattern was consistent. German engineers would examine American vehicles and weapons, identify their technical specifications, note their crude or simple construction, and conclude that German alternatives were superior. Then those same German engineers would add caveats about American production capacity, supply chain efficiency, and ease of maintenance. The caveats were almost always ignored by decision-makers. In November 1943, the United States military conducted formal testing of captured Kübelwagens at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The tests were thorough and professional. American engineers concluded that the Kübelwagen was simpler to manufacture than the Jeep, easier on fuel consumption, and adequately capable for its designed role. But the official United States War Department technical manual, published in March 1945, stated definitively, "The Volkswagen, the German equivalent of the United States Jeep, is inferior in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations." The contradiction between field testing and official assessment was striking. It suggested that both nations struggled with objective evaluation of enemy equipment, that ideology colored technical judgment on both sides. But the crucial difference was this: America's industrial capacity meant their assessments didn't matter strategically. Even if the Kübelwagen had been genuinely superior, which combat conditions proved it wasn't, Germany couldn't produce enough of them to matter. Meanwhile, America was building Jeeps at a rate of one every 90 seconds during peak production. That was the lesson Friedrich Steiner learned from the broken Jeep in the Ardennes Forest, that Hans Müller learned in American prisoner of war camps, that German industry learned in the Reconstruction years after the war. Wars aren't won by the best weapon. They're won by the most weapons that actually work when needed. They're won by logistics chains that never break. They're won by vehicles that soldiers can maintain with basic tools and minimal training. They're won in factories and on assembly lines, not just on battlefields. The Jeep became a teacher more effective than any classroom. It taught Germany that ideology cannot defeat industrial mathematics. It taught the world that pragmatism beats perfection when lives depend on equipment functioning under impossible conditions. It taught military planners that accessibility matters more than sophistication, that reliability matters more than performance, that simplicity matters more than elegance. The legacy of those lessons shaped the Cold War and beyond. When the United States developed the high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, the Humvee, decades later, the core design principles came directly from World War II Jeep experience. When other nations developed their military utility vehicles, they studied the Jeep's success. The Toyota Land Cruiser, the Land Rover, the UAZ 452 in the Soviet Union, all owed conceptual debt to the lessons learned from the Willys MB. Even civilian vehicles were transformed. The entire sport utility vehicle category that dominates modern roads traces its lineage back to the military Jeep. The idea that ordinary people could own capable, go-anywhere vehicles came from watching Jeeps perform impossible tasks during the war. In 1991, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers designated the Willys MB Jeep as an international historic mechanical engineering landmark. The citation recognized it as one of the most significant vehicles in automotive history, not because it was the fastest or most powerful, but because it changed how nations thought about military transportation and civilian vehicle capability. The New York Museum of Modern Art includes a military Jeep in its permanent collection as one of the very few genuine expressions of machine art. Not art for decoration, but art in the sense of form, perfectly matched to function. Every element serving a purpose. Nothing wasted. Nothing unnecessary. Today, 80 years after World War II, original Willys MB Jeeps remain operational. Collectors maintain them. Museums preserve them. Restoration specialists rebuild them using parts manufactured specifically for that purpose. In France, farmers still occasionally unearth buried Jeeps from fields where they were abandoned in 1944 and 1945. Some of those vehicles, after restoration, still run. That durability tells its own story about the difference between engineering for impression and engineering for endurance. The broken Jeep that Friedrich Steiner examined in December 1944 taught him a lesson his training had never included. That German engineering excellence, which he had believed in absolutely, had been optimized for the wrong war. They had designed vehicles for limited conflicts with professional armies and established supply lines. America designed vehicles for total war, fought across continents by conscript armies with improvised logistics. Germany assumed skilled craftsmen would always be available. America assumed soldiers would learn on the job with minimal training. Germany valued performance at the edge of capability. America valued reliable performance under worst-case conditions. In the end, American assumptions about modern warfare proved correct because they were based on the reality of industrial total war, not on ideological fantasies about racial superiority or warrior spirit or engineering genius overcoming material disadvantages. The Jeep didn't just help win World War II, it helped define what winning meant in the industrial age. It demonstrated that modern wars are won by nations that can produce reliable equipment faster than enemies can destroy it, that can supply their forces anywhere in the world, that can maintain complex logistics networks under combat conditions, that design weapons and vehicles for the soldiers who will actually use them, not for engineers who appreciate technical sophistication. Major Friedrich Steiner survived the war. His name appears in captured Wehrmacht Vehicle Recovery Section records. After his release from Allied detention in 1947, he returned to Germany and worked in the automotive industry during Reconstruction. He never published his wartime technical reports, but colleagues remembered him as an advocate for simplified design and standardized manufacturing processes. The lessons from the broken Jeep, it seems, stayed with him. Hans Müller also survived and returned to civilian life. He opened a vehicle repair shop in the Federal Republic of Germany. Former soldiers who served with him remembered that he kept an American Jeep in his workshop, not for customers, but as a teaching tool. He would show young mechanics how it was designed, explaining how American engineers had solved problems that German designers had made complex. "Learn from this," he would tell them. "Complexity is not sophistication. Simplicity that works is the highest form of engineering." The story of the broken Jeep captures a larger truth about World War II. The Axis powers lost not because they lacked courage or tactical skill or even technological innovation. They lost because they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of industrial warfare. They believed that superior weapons would overcome numerical disadvantages, that ideological determination would overcome material shortages, that technical excellence would triumph over mass production. They were wrong about all of it. The Allies, particularly the United States, understood that modern war was ultimately a contest of industrial capacity, that the nation which could build more tanks, more planes, more ships, more trucks, and more jeeps would eventually prevail, assuming reasonable quality and effective logistics. The Jeep embodied that understanding. It wasn't trying to be the best vehicle ever designed. It was trying to be good enough, producible at massive scale, maintainable by minimally trained soldiers, and reliable under conditions that would destroy more sophisticated designs. It succeeded at all of those goals, and in succeeding, it helped change the outcome of the most destructive war in human history. When we look at a World War II Jeep today, we should see more than a vintage military vehicle. We should see a physical manifestation of the industrial and philosophical systems that defeated fascism. Every standardized bolt, every accessible component, every illustrated maintenance procedure, every design choice that prioritized function over form represents a decision that helped win the war. The broken Jeep in the Ardennes Forest taught Major Steiner what Nazi propaganda had worked so hard to conceal. That America's industrial system, which German ideology dismissed as crude and inferior, was actually the most formidable weapon in the Allied arsenal, more powerful than any tank, more decisive than any general's tactics, more important than any battlefield victory. Because it kept Allied forces supplied, mobile, and operational, no matter what the enemy did. That was the lesson written in standardized bolts and accessible spark plugs and illustrated repair manuals. The lesson that German officers learned too late. The lesson that shaped post-war industrial development. The lesson that remains relevant today for anyone studying military history or industrial design or engineering philosophy. Wars are won in factories. Logistics matter more than tactics. Reliability beats sophistication. Simplicity that works beats complexity that impresses. The Jeep taught Germany to lose. But in losing and learning those lessons, German engineers and industrialists helped build an economic miracle in the decades after the war. They took American pragmatism, combined it with German precision, and created something new. The student learned from the teacher, and both were better for it. That, ultimately, is the real legacy of the broken Jeep that Friedrich Steiner couldn't stop thinking about in the winter of 1944. Not just that it worked when it shouldn't have, not just that it kept running when German vehicles failed, but that it represented a way of thinking about engineering and production and logistics that was fundamentally superior for modern industrial warfare. A way of thinking that Germany would have to adopt if it wanted to rebuild and compete in the post-war world. The Jeep was a teacher, and the lessons it taught changed everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.